Here is a summary of Exodus at, I think, about 25% the words of the original text. And before I start, I'll say the right way to know Exodus is to read the original text, the full original text. But even still, I think this summary is helpful in remembering the full text. So to start, in Exodus, first it is mentioned that the Israelites, the sons of Jacob, aka Israel, were fertile in Egypt. They reproduced greatly after Israel and Joseph's generation died. And eventually the new Pharaoh did not know Joseph, so enslaved the Israelites, yet they still increased in population. The Pharaoh planned to kill newborn male Israelites because he saw their population growth as excessive. But the nurses would not obey the plan to kill the Israelite baby males. The nurses were fearing God, telling the Pharaoh, "The Israelite women quickly birth the boys without the nurses' help," which dodges the murder scheme. And God blessed those nurse midwives, while the Pharaoh then ordered the Egyptians to drown the Israelite boys in the Nile. And among the Israelite boys born then was one descended from Levi. Levi was Leah and Israel's son. This baby was beautiful, yet was eventually placed in the Nile too, in a floating basket. He was rescued by the sympathetic daughter of the Pharaoh, aided by the baby's sister and mother. The Pharaoh's daughter adopted him, naming him Moses. Moses grew up and murdered an Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew, and Moses fled when the Pharaoh planned to kill Moses for it. And where Moses fled to, he helped 7 daughters who struggled to water their flocks. Then their father, a priest, befriended Moses and gave Moses a daughter as a wife. Much later, the Pharaoh died, and the Israelites cried in slavery. And God heard, noticing them finally, remembering his covenant with Abram, Isaac, and Israel. Then on a place called the Mountain of God, Moses was tending a flock for his priest father-in-law, and there Moses saw a bush on fire, miraculously not being consumed by its flames. And God spoke to Moses from the bush, ordering Moses to go rescue the Israelites from Egypt, and to tell the Israelites that the God of their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has heard their cries and will deliver them now to the promised land, flowing with milk and honey. After the rescue, Moses must worship God back on this mountain of God. God told Moses to ask the Pharaoh to release the Israelites, and the Pharaoh will, because God will smite Egypt with wonders, thus releasing Israelites with wealth too. To God, Moses expressed skepticism and doubt about if the Israelites would follow Moses and believe God sent him. God assured Moses they'll listen by telling and showing Moses that God will make Moses do convincing miracles. Moses was still doubtful over his ability to speak, which angered God, but God compromised, planning for Moses' brother Aaron to do the speaking, where God guides Moses to play the role of God to Aaron and telling him what to say. Moses got permission from his father-in-law to go back to Egypt as directed by God, who assured Moses that Moses' former persecutors are dead. And God told Moses to ask the Pharaoh for the Israelites' release and to show the Pharaoh the miracles. But God will stiffen the Pharaoh's heart, and the Pharaoh won't release them at first attempts. So to tell the Pharaoh that God said Israel is God's firstborn son, for punishment over refusing their release, God will slay the Pharaoh's firstborn son. God almost killed the Pharaoh's son, but the mother circumcised the son, and God let him live. The mother then called her son a bridegroom of blood. Then Aaron, led by God, met with Moses, who explained God's revealed plan of them both rescuing the Israelites. So they both went to the Israelites, Aaron speaking Moses' words of God, Moses doing the miracles, and the Israelites were convinced. So Moses and Aaron asked the Pharaoh to let the Israelites obey the instructions of their God by letting them leave for worship. But the Pharaoh, not believing the Israelite God, only hardened the Israelites' workload by demanding the same brick production while now not providing them with the necessary straw, making them get their own straw. So the foremen of the Israelites then disliked and regretted Moses for worsening their relationship with the Pharaoh. And Moses asked God why God led Moses to bring more harm upon the Israelites. God told Moses that Moses will soon see a greater might force the Pharaoh to free the Israelites. And God reminded Moses of the promises and covenant God made with Abram, Isaac, and Israel, confirming that now is the time that God will liberate the Israelites to fulfill that covenant, since God has heard their cries. God told Moses again to try to convince the Israelites and the Pharaoh to go along with the freeing of the Israelites. But Moses was doubtful either would listen. Then in Exodus, the descendants of Israel's, aka Jacob's sons, are named. And brothers Aaron and Moses are actually great-great-grandsons of Israel, aka Jacob, descended from Leah and Israel's son Levi. It is the same Aaron and Moses who obeyed God to ask the Pharaoh to release the Israelites. It is the same Moses who doubted his impeded speech would persuade the Pharaoh. God insisted to Moses that Moses try again to convince the Pharaoh to liberate the Israelites. Aaron as Moses' prophet, and Moses playing the role of God to the Pharaoh. God told Moses that God will make the Pharaoh refuse to free the Israelites this time too, giving God the opportunity to multiply the miracles that prove to Egypt that Israel's God is the real God. God helped Moses and Aaron plan the demonstrations of miracles to the Pharaoh. Then they went and did the miracles, while asking the Pharaoh for Israel's freedom. But the Pharaoh refused, after summoning Egyptian magicians who proved they could do the exact same miracles, like turning a rod into a serpent and turning Egypt's water to blood. Then God planned with Moses to threaten the Pharaoh with another miracle, an infestation of frogs. After that, and 7 more miracles ranging from infestation-related to disease-related to weather-related curses inflicted upon the Pharaoh in Egypt by God, sometimes presented by Aaron or Moses. All Moses and Aaron experienced was that the Pharaoh pleaded to Moses and Aaron for relief from their God, promising to release the Israelites if the curses stop. But then the Pharaoh would go back on his word, as God foretold, by not releasing the Israelites, sometimes proving Egyptian magicians can reproduce the same spells, but for later curses not even being able to. Some curses even attacked only Egyptians, not Israelites, highlighting God's awareness of their difference. Even as Egyptian magicians advised the Pharaoh that unreproducible spells were proof of God from Moses, the Pharaoh still deceived Moses, asking for relief in exchange for Israelite freedom, then receiving relief from God and stubbornly not following through with the promise to free the Israelites, even despite Moses catching on, asking the Pharaoh to stop being dishonest. Eventually, Pharaoh threateningly warned Moses not to come see Pharaoh's face anymore, and Moses ominously agreed. He shall not see his face anymore. After those marvels, the Lord finally told Moses the next plague will lead to the Pharaoh letting the Israelites go. God advised Moses to order the Israelites to borrow gold and silver, and God made Egyptians act favorably towards the Israelites. Even Moses was very esteemed by the Pharaoh's courtiers and people. Then Moses warned Pharaoh of God's next plague. All firstborn of Egypt, from royalty down to beasts, shall die. Then Egypt will bow to the Lord. Then God told Moses and Aaron that the Israelites' own personal months will begin like this. First, all Israelites must get a perfect male lamb, appropriate in size for each household, shared if necessary for smaller households. Then slaughter it and place some of its blood on all of their Israelite doorposts and lintels. Then eat the lamb only by roasting with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. They shall quickly eat all of it. Any leftovers burn, and eat it while dressed, holding their staffs. Then God will smite all firstborn Egyptians, but pass over any house with lamb blood on the doorposts and lintels. Thus it became called the Passover sacrifice. Then for the next 7 days all Israelites must eat unleavened bread, where on the first and seventh day no one works except to prepare the food, and on the seventh day there is a festival of the Lord. To commemorate God liberating them from Egypt, they shall re-perform this unleavened bread ritual annually forever, on the first month from the 14th day to 7 days later, the 21st day. And anyone who eats leavened bread then shall be cut off from Israel. Moses told all Israelites to do all this, and they all obeyed. Then God smited firstborn Egyptians, passing over and sparing all houses with the lamb blood as the sign. And Pharaoh finally, impatiently, fearfully made all Israelites leave Egypt. And they did leave perfectly, with belongings and livestock and all that borrowed gold and silver. The Israelites had been in Egypt for 430 years before God's night of liberating them. God also instructed Moses and Aaron the following about the Passover offering. It shall be eaten only inside the houses, without breaking any of its bones, and no foreigner shall eat it. Any foreigners must become circumcised, then they are no longer foreigners. They are part of the Israelite community and may participate in the Passover sacrifice. Israel obeyed, and God freed them from Egypt. God also told Moses to consecrate to God all firstborn of Israel, man and beast. So Moses told the Israelites to do this, also reminding them to continue the unleavened bread tradition for every year, and to explain to their sons they do it to serve as a sign, like a sign on the hand and forehead, for when mighty God liberated them from Egypt and gave them promised land. And to explain to their sons that every firstborn male Israelite is consecrated to God, to commemorate how God slew the firstborn Egyptians. When they left Egypt, God first led them along a peaceful path, as not to scare them back to Egypt from encountering war. Moses took Joseph's bones up along with him, just as Joseph wanted, now that God had noticed the Israelites, giving them their promised land. Throughout their travels, God led them as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Through Moses, God guided the Israelites' direction in travel, bringing them to face the sea eventually. And God told Moses the Pharaoh will change his mind again and pursue the Israelites, so that God will make another example over gaining glory over Egypt. So the Pharaoh did, wanting to re-enslave them. Israel saw Egypt coming in the distance, and Israel was terrified and regretful over fleeing, debating in their minds the favor of the enslavement they once had versus the death they anticipate. Israel questioned Moses, and Moses questioned God, but then God allowed Moses to miraculously split the sea for the Israelites to flee on the dry sea bottom. A wall of water on the right and left. Egypt pursued them along that sea bottom, as God interposed himself as a dark cloud between the two groups, following behind Israel, obscuring Egypt's view, and slowing Egypt's wheels. Egypt felt doubt, and Israel got out, crossing that sea. Then God returned the water to place, drowning Egypt still in the sea. Israel feared God after witnessing this miraculous deliverance. Then Moses and the Israelites all sang a song to God, which praises God's triumph over his enemies. Then Aaron's prophetess sister, followed by all the women, danced with timbrels, joining the singing. As they traveled on, Moses pleaded to God about their struggle to find water eventually, And God showed Moses wood to throw into bitter, undrinkable water, which miraculously turned the bitter water sweet. And there, God said, if they remain good and obey God, then God as their healer will never bring disease on them like he did on the Egyptians. Then they traveled to more water. Then they traveled farther from there, and on the first day of the second month of their departure from Egypt, they came to the wilderness of Sin, but grumbled against Moses and Aaron there, even saying they would have preferred God kill them back in Egypt because now they're starving. There God told Moses that God will rain bread and test the Israelites with instructions to gather it. And on the sixth day, they will miraculously have double what they gather that day. Then Moses told them to expect God to soon solve their hunger with flesh to eat in the evening and bread in the morning, and to trust the Lord, since it's him they're grumbling against. Moses told Aaron to tell the Israelites to advance towards the Lord, and when they did, God appeared to them as a cloud of smoke. In the evening, quail to eat covered the camp, and in the morning, after the dew lifted, a thin, flaky substance covered the ground, which they realized was bread. And no matter how much they gathered of this thin bread, each person ended up with a measurement called an omer. Moses told them to leave no leftovers. Those who did saw their leftovers rotted, angering Moses. So they gathered it every morning, since it melted as the sun grew hot. And on the sixth day, they gathered their omer, but miraculously, each person noticed 2 omers in their possession. And Moses explained the Lord meant for this, so that they may rest on the 7th day, the Sabbath, when there will be no bread to gather, yet they will have extra. Some Israelites still went to gather bread on the 7th day, yet found none, and Moses scolded them for not obeying the Lord's Sabbath. Israel named the bread manna. It was like coriander seed, white and tasted like wafers in honey. God commanded Moses to keep an omer of manna in a jar throughout the ages to remember the miracle. Israel ate manna for 40 years until they came to settled land. Journeying on, they became thirsty again. They doubted Moses and God, but God instructed Moses to show the elders Moses striking a rock with his rod, causing water to gush out from the rock. He did, and they gave the place a name whose meaning reminds them of how they questioned God's presence among them. Then the people of Amalek fought Israel. Moses made Joshua lead Israel in battle. And as Moses watched, Israel would prevail whenever Moses would raise his hand. So Aaron and Hur helped support his hands when he got tired and sat. Joshua and Israel won. God told Moses to write and read aloud to Joshua a document where God promises to battle and defeat Amalek throughout the ages. Then priest Jethro, who was Moses' father-in-law, heard how much God helped freed Moses and Israel from Egypt. So Jethro brought Moses' sons and wife to Moses. And when Jethro got to Moses, Moses showed respect and told Jethro the stories of all that God had done to Egypt for Israel. And then Jethro worshipped God, sacrificing, while others joined. The next day, Jethro observed Moses be the judge of disputes among the Israelite people, enforcing God's law. But Jethro advised Moses to delegate, to lighten the workload by employing godly men to handle minor disputes, while Moses handles major ones. Moses heeded Jethro's advice. Then Jethro went back home. On exactly the 3rd new moon after Israel's departure from Egypt, they came to the wilderness of Sinai, and God called Moses up the mountain there, where God told Moses to relay a message to Israel, for Israel to remain obedient and faithful to God. Then they will be God's holy treasured possession. They all promised their obedience. And God told Moses that God will reveal himself to Israel in smoke on Mount Sinai in 3 days. But for the 2 days leading up, they must be pure, wash their clothes, and avoid women, and must not touch the mountain. Anyone or any beast that does touch the mountain must be killed. But let the executor not even touch that tainted man or beast. Kill him by shooting or stoning. Moses told them all this, saying, when he blasts the ram's horn, they may go to the mountain. On the 3rd day, as they all came to the base of the mountain, Moses blasted the ram horn, and God did reveal himself in smoke, covering the mountain, conversing with Moses from a thunder voice, calling Moses only further up the mountain. God told Moses to go back down and warn the people not to come up the mountain to see God, or they will die. Then God almost gave priests permission, as long as they're clean. But Moses reminded God how God said, none of the people shall approach, and God agreed, ordering Moses to go down and come back up with Aaron. No one else may approach. So Moses descended the mountain and spoke to the Israelites. God spoke all these rules to the Israelites, starting with the 10 Commandments. Number 1, have no other gods besides the true Lord your God. Number 2, have no idols, because God would be jealous. Number 3, never swear falsely by the Lord's name. 4, keep the Sabbath day holy and do not work on that day, because it's God's day of rest. 5, honor your mother and father. 6, don't murder. 7, don't have non-marital sex. 8, don't steal. 9, don't lie. 10, don't crave to own your neighbor's possessions. Then God spoke various other rules, like worship rules, fair slave treatment rules, then many punishment/forgiveness rules, based on the details of a range of crimes. In general, lesser punishments leading into total forgiveness are applied in certain cases where a person is either not totally responsible for the harm they were involved with, or they had no malicious intent. There are other rules about appropriate civilized, non-discriminatory conduct and remaining faithful exclusively to God, with warnings not to worship any other gods. And there are other rules about obeying several certain stated ritualistic commandments. Then God invited Moses back up the mountain, reminding him to bring Aaron, but also now ordering Moses to bring Nadab, Abihu, and 70 elders, distinguishing Moses by permitting him only to approach further. After Moses repeated God's commandments to the people, they all promised obedience and performed a burnt offering/blood sacrifice ritual, establishing a covenant with God about these commandments. Then Moses and his group with the elders attended their scheduled ascent, and they safely ate as God let them see him standing beautifully. Then only Moses was invited to approach further to receive the commandments on stone tablets. So Moses did, ascending a cloud towards God's fiery presence. Remaining in the clouds for 40 days and nights, God told Moses to tell the Israelite people to bring God certain gifts, which God then lists, like precious metals, materials, oils, spices, and precious stones, for building certain holy things, and to make God a sanctuary, a tabernacle, for God to dwell in among them, which God will provide instructions for building. Then first God provided instructions for building an ark of acacia wood with specific measurements and qualities, with many parts to be made of gold, including poles for carrying it. Its purpose is for depositing inside it the tablets of the pact God will give to Moses. Its cover will have guarding cherubim. God then also provided specific construction instructions for a table and a lampstand, for 7 lamps, with much parts of both also being of pure gold. Then God provided construction instructions for the tabernacle, with measurement and material details. The instructions included details about various cloths, details about how to connect the cloths to make it one whole, and details of various parts, several of which are to be made of acacia wood and copper, silver, and gold, where some areas are decorated with cherubim, like the curtain inside. Both the curtain and the tent's screen entrance are to be made of blue, purple, and crimson yarns and fine twisted linen. The curtain inside is to serve as a partition between the Holy and the Holy of Holies, behind which the Ark of the Pact is to be placed, and outside of which the table and the lampstands are to be placed. God then provides construction instructions for both the square acacia wood altar and the tabernacle's enclosure, where several parts of both are to be made of copper, while the latter does contain the same colored yarns and linen, yet also some silver. God also told Moses to instruct the Israelites of their permanent due to bring beaten olive oil for the lamps. Then God instructed Moses to bring forward Aaron and Aaron's sons to serve as priests, and to instruct people with the God-given gift of skill to make Aaron's vestments. God then instructively described each piece of those vestments in detail. Much of those vestments were to have blue, purple, and crimson yarns with gold components, and 2 lazuli stones for the 2 shoulder pieces, 1 lazuli with the names of 6 sons of Israel, and the other with the other 6 sons, in order of birth. Also, God describes the breastpiece to have similar details, yet also containing 12 different specific named precious stones, 12 corresponding to the number of sons of Israel. There are several other details, one being that Aaron's robe shall be blue and have gold bells around it to be heard when he enters and exits the holy sanctuary. Other pieces are mentioned, including headpieces, some of linen, and some similar pieces for Aaron's sons. It is a law for all time that Aaron and his descendants must wear all that was described when they enter the tent of meeting or the sanctuary, so that they are not punished with death. Then God gave Moses instructions on consecrating Aaron and Aaron's sons to serve as priests. The instructions included details of certain unleavened foods and oil to present, as well as a young bull and 2 rams to offer. Orders to wash and clothe Aaron and Aaron's sons in the clothing God described. And further, very specific details on how to offer the bull and rams, how they shall be led to the front of the tent of meeting, how Aaron and his sons shall lay their hands on the animal's heads and slaughter it. God provides very specific details for the ritualistic steps for each animal, like the dashing of blood and burning of body parts of each animal, the bull's parts being a sin offering, and the rams being a pleasing odor to the Lord. The instructions differ slightly for each animal, where the second ram, called the ram of ordination, will have its burnt offering to include burning the unleavened foods. Certain of the body parts of the ram of ordination shall be a permanent due from the Israelites to Aaron's descendants. Aaron's son who becomes a priest shall inherit Aaron's vestments and wear them for 7 days. Certain of the ram of ordination's body parts and unleavened foods shall be eaten by only those in the ritual, and burn what's not eaten. There are further instructions, like purifying the altar for 7 days, doing the bull's sin offering 7 days, and every day for the generations offer 2 lambs, 1 in the morning and 1 at twilight, each offering with the same certain measurements of other specifically named foods. God tells Moses that there at the tent of meeting, God will be with them. God also described to Moses the construction details for building an incense altar, much of which was to be made of gold, to be placed outside of the curtain which veils the ark. And Aaron shall burn non-alien incense on it daily and purify it once a year, with blood from the sin offering. Then God tells Moses to require from the Israelites a half shekel when Moses takes their census, as offering to be used for the service of the tent of meeting. God also tells Moses to make a copper laver and stand for washing, and to place it between the tent of the meeting and the altar, for Aaron and his sons to wash their hands and feet as a law before services so they don't die. Then God lists specific spices for making a holy oil, and other specific herbs for making an incense powder, the oil for anointing everything in the tent of meeting, Aaron and his sons, some of the incense to be powdered and put before the pact, and no one shall use or remake either for their own purpose. Then, while speaking to Moses, God specifically named 2 men, one of the tribe of Judah and the other of Dan, and God endowed these men with certain craft skills, and together they will be able to build every single thing God recently described. Then God told Moses to remind the Israelites not to work on the Sabbath day, otherwise they shall be put to death, for it's God's day of rest. At the end of their meeting on Mount Sinai, God gave Moses the 2 tablets of the pact God wrote. When Moses had not returned from the mountain for a while, the Israelites asked Aaron to make a god for them, impatiently having lost faith in Moses. So Aaron did. Using their gold earrings, he made a molten calf, and they worshipped it. God told Moses to quickly return down to them, informing Moses of their calf idol sin. God also told Moses that God will destroy them in anger. But Moses talked God out of this plan, reminding God how God promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob offspring as countless as the stars. Then Moses descended the mountain with the 2 tablets God wrote, approaching the Israelites' songs. Upon arrival, realizing the songs were worship of the calf, in anger, Moses broke those tablets and ground the calf into powder, putting it in their water, and made them drink it. Moses interrogated Aaron about their sin, and Aaron explained. They asked him for God. They lost faith in Moses over his absence, and when they gave Aaron their gold, he threw it in the fire, and a calf came out. Blaming Aaron, Moses gathered those still with faith in the true God, ordering them to slay their fellow Israelites, symbolizing how they've turned against each other. Around 3,000 were slain. And the next day Moses told them he will plead to God to forgive them. And Moses did, asking that if God does not forgive them, for God to erase Moses from God's record. But God replied, saying, only those who have sinned will God erase from his record and punish. Then God did bring a plague upon them. Then God ordered Moses to journey out with the Israelites to their promised land, the land that God promised to Abram, Isaac, and Jacob that he would give to their descendants. God told Moses that he would remove the other dwellers of the lands beforehand, but told Moses to tell the Israelites that God will not go in their midst, since they're stiff-necked, and God would kill them. Now Moses, he would pitch the tent of meeting near their camp, meant for seeking God. And Moses would enter it, and a pillar of cloud would descend and stand at the entrance of the tent. The Israelites would see the cloud and bow. In Moses' face-to-face talks with God, Moses asked God that if Moses has been so singled out and favored by God, for God to provide more guidance in God's ways. God promised to go in the lead, which Moses also expressed was necessary. God then told Moses, no one can see God's face and live. God will shield Moses with his hand, pass by, then remove his hand, and Moses will see God's back. God and Moses remade the tablets that Moses shattered, and they both met atop Mount Sinai. No one else allowed. There, God proclaimed himself as loving and forgiving, yet still willing to punish. Moses then bowed, asking God to be in his people's midst and forgive. God said he will work unique wonders among his people and drive out the other inhabitants of their land. God then commanded Moses to destroy and reject those foreign people's religions. God then repeats previously described ritualistic commandments, including those which prescribe unleavened bread, and ones about firstlings of the womb, from men to livestock, being God's possession, and other commandments. Moses also rewrote the 10 Commandments. Moses did not eat or drink for 40 days or nights. And when Moses came down off the mountain with the 2 tablets, his face shined as an after effect of having spoke with God. And people noticed, and Moses spoke with them, but after that put a veil over his face to speak with the people, removing it to speak with God. Then Moses relayed God's commands to the Israelite people concerning their work, for them to work 6 days, but not on the Sabbath, or they'll be put to death, and to bring offerings like the precious metals, colored yarns, wood, precious stones, oil, etc., and to bring skilled workers among themselves for building all the holy things for the tabernacle, the ark, etc., which Moses lists. Then the Israelites did bring the offerings which God commanded. Then Moses pointed out to the Israelites 2 specific men there, the exact 2 skilled men from the tribes of Judah and Dan, which God promised earlier to Moses, which God endowed with skills for this work, thus highlighting God's fulfillment of that promise. Then Moses ordered them and the Israelites to do this work that God commanded, and to bring the offerings, which they did. Eventually Moses learned that they were bringing too many gifts, more than necessary, and then asked them to stop. Then what they built for the tabernacle and the ark, etc., is described in thorough detail at this point in Exodus. And the description matches exactly with God's earlier detailed instructions. The skilled craftsman from the tribe of Judah is who built the ark, the table, the utensils, the lampstand, the incense altar, the altar for burnt offering, the laver, its stand, and the tabernacle's enclosure. Moses made the Levites draw up the plans for all this, under the direction of priest Aaron's son, and the skilled craftsman from Judah built it all, with the skilled craftsman of Dan at his side. Then in Exodus, all the quantities of gold, silver, and copper, and what they were used for is recorded here. The vestments they made for Aaron and his sons are also thoroughly described. The ephod, its shoulder pieces, the breastpiece, the robe, the tunic, the headdress, the turbans, and the frontlet. And every piece was made exactly as the Lord had commanded. The Israelites brought all the completed works to Moses, and Moses blessed them. God told Moses to set up the tabernacle on the first day of the first month, then re-instructed Moses on exactly how to set up the tabernacle, and everything included with it, like where to put the tables, the lamps, the altar, etc., to anoint everything with oil, to wash and anoint Aaron and Aaron's sons and put the vestments on Aaron. Everything God commanded, Moses did, and then the cloud covered the tent, filling the tabernacle with God's presence. And Moses did not enter it then. Only when the cloud lifted, the Israelites would continue journeying. Over the tabernacle was a cloud by day and a fire by night, visible to the Israelites throughout their journeys. And that's all of Exodus.